All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for taking the opportunity to join us this evening. This is the Strauss Center's evening panel on Section 230, the 2020 presidential election and the future of the internet. My name is Bryan Jones. I am an adjunct professor at the University of Texas and a affiliate of the Strauss Center, which is kind enough to be hosting our event this evening. So really fortunate that we have three experts here this evening who I'm super excited to dive into this topic with. We've got Professor Citron, we have Professor Kosseff, and we have Professor Daskal. And while I could do introductions for each of them, I think it probably would be best coming from them. So if each of you would give a quick 30-second background, including your relevant works on Section 230, I think everybody would really appreciate hearing it directly from you. Jeff, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. I'm Jeff Kosseff. I'm a professor in the Cyber Science Department at the U.S. Naval Academy. Have to give a quick disclaimer that the views I expressed today are only mine, not the Naval Academy, Navy, DoD. My experience with Section 230, I've been writing about it for a while. I published a book last year called The 26 Words That Created the Internet, which is about Section 230. And at the time that I wrote it, I did not think there would be panels about Section 230 or a lot of stuff that's going on right now. So it's an exciting time, but yeah, so I'm excited to be here.
Great. Danielle?
Okay, I'll unmute myself. I'm Danielle Citron. I am a professor at BU Law School, the vice president of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. And the first time I wrote about Section 230 was in 2008 in an article called Cyber Civil Rights. And so I've been a student of Section 230, been writing about it. I wrote with our wonderful colleague, Bobby Chesney, most recently in a piece about deepfakes and how we should reform it. So there you go.
Great. And Jen?
Hi, starting again. Hi, I'm Jen Daskal. I'm a professor and a faculty director of a new tech law and security program at American University, where we are, among other things, doing a lot of work on regulation of harmful content online. I am an aficionado of Danielle's work and Jeff's work, and love them both and love their work, and have written recently a little bit about the EO that I'm sure we will, the executive order that I'm sure we'll get into in a few moments.
Absolutely. Thank you all again for joining us in the Strauss Center this evening. So the main topic tonight is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. It's been called the Magna Carta of the Internet, the 26 words that created the Internet. Essentially been put on par with some people in the technology world, up there with the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment in terms of creating free speech for the internet. There's a lot in that. There's a lot more than just 26 words as well. But to give us a quick history, since you wrote an entire book on this topic, Jeff, you want to give us the background of why 230 got started and how we got this law to begin with?
Sure, I'll try to give a really quick overview, and I apologize to Danielle because we've been on enough panels where they've all started this way. So, but yeah, so I mean, Section 230 was basically created to address a problem that was in the common law and First Amendment protections for platforms, and that was that under these pre-existing rules that really were created back to the times when bookstore owners were being prosecuted for selling obscene books. The rule was that if you were the distributor of someone else's content, you were only liable if you knew or had reason to know of the illegality. And that was pretty predictable for bookstores, newsstands, that sort of thing. But when it got to the early online services like Prodigy and CompuServe, there was this weird set of court rulings that basically said if a platform does not do any moderation of user content whatsoever, it will be considered a distributor and it'll have the protections of bookstores. But if it starts to have user policies, moderators, that sort of thing, it becomes a publisher and it then becomes strictly liable for that content. So the ruling that really set this off was in 1995 involving Prodigy. At the time, the telecom laws were being overhauled for the first time in 6 decades. So there were 2 proposals, one in the Senate, which was the Communications Decency Act, which created criminal penalties for transmitting indecent material that could be accessed by minors. And the House wanted to do something different. So they passed they proposed Section 230, which has a few provisions, the 26 words saying that if you're a provider or user of an interactive computer service, you're not going to be treated as the publisher or speaker of content that someone else provides. Now that, and then there was a second provision in there that says you're also not liable if you take good faith efforts to restrict access to objectionable content. Now, the way the courts ended up interpreting that first part, it was unclear whether it would mean that platforms would just become distributors, meaning once they know or have reason to know that they would then be liable, or does it mean that there is a strong, almost absolute immunity? And the courts took the latter view. And it just kind of, and I mean, I actually think that were we in 1997, there possibly could have been a different interpretation as the first court opinion, and the internet would look very different. But basically that precedent by judges, at least, has not really been questioned all that much. So it's created this really, really strong protection for platforms, both to make the decision to keep user content up, to take it down, and to do everything in between. So I call it the 26 words that created the internet, because it really allowed platforms to base their business models, for better or worse, around content that users provide, because it really changes the entire landscape for liability.
Now, Jeff, I appreciate that. There are 2 common misconceptions about Section 230 that we
Only
probably
2?
should. Well, there are 2 major misconceptions, including one propagated by the junior senator from the state of Texas around neutrality and Section 230. And so before we really get into some of the other deeper topics, can one of you address whether or not Section 230 forces a internet company to be neutral?
No. That's I mean, I'm Danielle and Jen can also talk to this, but I mean, the point of Section 230 is for platforms not to be neutral. Congress would not have passed. There wasn't even any discussion about let's give this industry absolute liability protection. There was definitely no discussion saying let's reward them for not doing anything to moderate content. The entire concern back then was that there was indecent material that was accessible by minors, and we want to encourage the platforms to take whatever steps. At the time it was using things like Net Nanny and Surfwatch, but any sort of moderation step. So there's a separate question of whether you want Section 230 to be conditioned on neutrality, and I think for policy reasons it's a really bad outcome. But the actual question of does Section 230 require neutrality, that's not, I mean, that's not really any serious argument when you look at the text or any of the history.
Got it. And then one other misconception: does a company have to be deemed either a publisher or a platform for this to apply? And is there a difference between the two? That's one that we often see in the media as being proposed as a major question of Section 230 liability.
I feel like, Jeff, that's when you hit your head against the wall. No,
yeah,
like,
yeah. I mean, I'll let you take this
no,
one.
no,
I'll give you
actually,
the honor.
I'd rather you do it. But just to underscore, sort of with a fine point, the first myth: the statute's title is Good Samaritan blocking and filtering of offensive content, right? So itself, right, the title itself is a call to block and filter offensive content, right? The idea of neutrality is so absurd, it makes my head hurt. So Jeff, I think, because Jeff is literally on the phone all day long with these reporters, Jeff, I think unless Jen wants to do it, this like absurd platform versus publishing
No,
thing, which is
yeah,
nowhere.
I mean, there's not anything called a platform in Section 230. There is an interactive computer service provider, which is in Section 230, but it says the interactive, so that may be what they mean by platform, but it says shall not be treated as the publisher or speaker. So there's not, I mean, that there's not a requirement. Now there was, PragerU came out with a video last week that I really hesitate to even address here, but they say, I'll let Danielle address it, but they basically say that the choice is between, I think, being a public forum and a publisher, which is also something that's not, that just is not in the law. And the reason I hesitate to address it is because I worry it gives that argument credibility, and it's just not there.
Yep. Great. So now that we've got those two misperceptions out of the way, and we can focus on what Section 230 really means, the most recent reason that we're talking about this is, of course, President Trump's executive order on preventing online censorship, which came out on May 28th of this year. This was following Twitter putting up a tag challenging the veracity of one of President Trump's tweets about the likelihood of an increase in fraud on mail-in ballots coming up in the upcoming election. Twitter went ahead and put this tag on there, in line, of course, with their terms of service. And 2 days later, the EO comes out. And of course, the EO is, Section 1 of the EO is written very broadly. In fact, it says, we must foster and protect diverse viewpoints in today's digital communications environment where all Americans can and should have a voice. We must seek transparency and accountability from online platforms and engage standards and tools to protect and preserve the integrity and openness of American discourse and freedom of expression. Jen, I know you've written about this a little bit, but do you get the sense that this EO is trying to accomplish that? And what's your view on the legality of this EO in totality?
So the short answer to your first question is no. There's some wonderful rhetoric at the beginning, but the substance of what's actually said in the EO does not match that rhetoric at all. And so you're absolutely right to point out that this came out on the heels of Twitter taking action against the president and treating the president like it would treat others who issue false statements about elections, and issuing a correction notice in ways that, in my view at least, was a very sensible response. But it's also worth noting that the EO has reportedly been in the works for quite some time, and in the works based off of a premise that there is a conservative bias amongst some of the big platforms. I should note that there is no real credible evidence at all to support the claim that, in fact, that there is a conservative bias, but that's the theory. And the EO, as a result, purports to set in motion a process by which the FCC would issue regulations that would, at least in theory, begin to lift some of the liability protections that Jeff was discussing for entities that acted in ways that were consistent with this perceived conservative bias. Now, there's all kinds of problems with that, and the FCC doesn't have jurisdiction under the law to issue these regulations. There's nothing obvious or evident that the FCC has any other basis for issuing these regulations. So there's those problems, as well as the substantive problems as to what the president is trying to do here. And then the other piece that he does is he directs all agencies within the executive to review their advertising funding and, in theory, stop issuing ads to entities that, again, exhibit this conservative bias. So all kinds of problems in the EO. There's efforts to increase, there's mixing and matching of both the publisher metaphor and the public forum language that Jeff correctly pointed out, neither of which is really apt here. And so all kinds of problems. And probably most concerning is this idea that the president is using his authority to try to basically clamp down on private entities that are not his perceived political agenda.
Danielle, anything to add? I know one of the sections in section 2 is somewhat maybe perhaps aligned with some of your viewpoints on limiting the liability that is created under section 230. I know that you have previously written about how section 230 is extended beyond the protection of liability, but it seems that this may be not necessarily that well drafted and has all sorts of other issues. So any thoughts from you on this EO?
So I read the EO as it's incomprehensible, friends. Like if you try to read it, but so I would say my views are really outside of what the EO accomplishes or tries to accomplish, which is effectively to give instructions to the FTC and FCC, federal agencies, to bring cases against platforms like Twitter and Facebook for filtering and blocking speech. And first of all, what's the cause of action, right? They call it deception, which may be under unfair and deceptive practice laws, but basically like wasting the agency staff time to think about bringing cases that have been struck down on 230 grounds, UDAP laws, for example, right? Now, the relevant part of this, so Bryan, the key part of the EO is actually, Jeff's title of his wonderful book is The 26 Words That Form the Internet. But most of the EO order, as Jen notes, really relates to 230C2, which is about allowing filtering if you do it in good faith, right? Removing content. And basically the administration wants the FTC and the FCC to look into deceptive monitoring, filtering, and blocking of their content that's inconsistent with terms of service, or it violates state and federal unfair and deceptive practice laws, I guess the federal ones. And it's a non-starter. So Marianne Franks and I, Bryan, you asked for literature. Marianne Franks and I just put up a piece on SSRN. It's called The Internet, a Speech Machine and Other Myths Confounding Section 230 Reform. I mean, this order strikes me as like taking every myth, tossing it into a blender, and then giving a lot of stress to scholars like Jeff, Jen, and I to have to explain why it's so absurd. So, Bryan, I would view the work that I do with Ben Wittes and with Bobby, arguing that we should keep the immunity in that 26 words that Jeff writes about, right? Treating, that is providing the immunity for under-filtering content of other people. We should keep that, but we should condition it on reasonable content moderation practices writ large. So the EO really is like, it's not about C1, it's instead about over-filtering, which my work with Ben and with Bobby doesn't address.
Jeff, is there any concern that the social media companies are, in fact, the argument today have become the town hall, and that the billionaires that own these companies are now directing what can and cannot be discussed on their platform, given their reach and their impact on presidential elections and even local elections? Are we empowering the social media companies with too much power to moderate and to filter voices?
Well, and this is where I feel like the arguments need to be really addressed, which is, there's a possibility, but there's not, I don't think that we have sufficient evidence either way to say, yeah, there's this concerted effort. We have anecdotal evidence in anecdotes where the platforms will justify it based on a certain provision of their policy, which in my mind demonstrates how difficult many moderation decisions are. So some moderation, it's really, it's very clear cut. And that I would say that's the majority of it when there are decisions to block content. But there are some that are really right on the line, and that's often what gets what raises the concern. Now, whether it's a concerted effort among platforms, I mean, that's not anything that I've seen any evidence of, or any sort of longitudinal studies that would make me think that there is. But I also think that, to your point about the platforms having power, absolutely, they have a huge amount of power. Section 230 was passed when the concerns were about Prodigy and CompuServe. If they kicked you off their services, it wouldn't be the end of the world. If YouTube demonetizes you, or Facebook kicks you off, or Twitter, that could be the end of your professional life. And that, I mean, that's a concern, obviously, to look at. And I wouldn't want to too quickly dismiss those concerns either.
Bryan, can I jump in here just really
Please.
quickly? First, on the empirical question, Facebook commissioned a report by Senator John Kyle to study whether there was bias against conservative voices, and he, on behalf of Covington, a law firm, and found that there wasn't. So it's just, to the extent that we've studied it, it seems that the answer is no. And the second thing is, Jeff rightly points that these platforms have tremendous amount of power. And I want to note that there are platforms that Section 230 sort of provides an immunity bubble for, platforms that are designed to destroy people's lives. So revenge porn sites, deep fake sex videos. There are sites whose business model is advertising, who have 50,000 deep fake sex videos inserting women's faces into porn without their permission. And these sites are earning a tremendous amount of money on advertising. Revenge porn sites are like a dime a dozen. I'm not going to tell you where to go and find them to give them more publicity. They're ruining people's lives because the nude photos appear in searches of people's names. And so, absolutely right, these platforms have a tremendous amount of power. That power comes with, by my lights, responsibility. It was the purpose of Section 230, was to basically condition that immunity on responsible practices. And what it allows is, of course, I think we could, and this is kind of the third intervention, if we're really worried about these platforms having tremendous amount of power over speech, and I think we should be, one thing that Jamil Jafar and I have thought about is whether should we have a federal law that declares that these platforms are basically public accommodations, and that there shouldn't be discrimination on the basis of protected characteristics, including political speech. Is that something we want to think about? I'm not suggesting that we want to, but the thing is about when they overfilter, what's the cause of action against the platform to stop the overfiltering? There really isn't one, right? Maybe under this theory of deception and inconsistency with your terms of service, but honestly, those have zero legs, right? So, we need to tailor, I think we need a sort of a new compact for Section 230. And the question is, of course, how we do that. But I think when we talk about power, so often it is the power to silence speakers. And at the same time, we forget that there are a lot of speakers whose raison d'etre is to silence other people and to ruin their lives. So I just think we ought to put that on the table.
Well, it's an interesting segue, because one of the opposite side of the aisle has been Vice President Biden, who came out in January with a quote that said, the idea that it's a tech company is that Section 230 should be revoked, immediately should be revoked. Number one, for Zuckerberg and other platforms, should be revoked because it's not merely an internet company, it's propagating falsehoods they know to be false. And when pushed on this, very clearly came out and said, hey, look, there's a lot of falsehoods that are spread on the internet, whether it's revenge porn, whether it's on democracy, whether it's on health, whether it's on fear, that there's going to be, groups of 6,000 individuals coming into your town on buses to destroy and rape and pillage. These types of lies and falsehoods get propagated on the social network. So, his response to come and say, well, we're not filtering enough, and therefore Section 230 should be revoked. What's the counter argument to that? Because it seems like 230 gives them permission to do exactly what they should be able to do, which is to filter out the falsehoods and the known untruths.
I guess I don't think we know for sure what the impact would be of eliminating Section 230 because we've had Section 230 for the entire modern internet. So, I mean, there are a few different potential outcomes. One would be, and this was to the result that Section 230 was actually intended to prevent, which was not doing any moderation. Because if you really took at least this one judge's view of the common law rule, you would actually increase your liability by doing any sort of editorial control, as they called it. So take a really hands-off approach. I think that would be counterproductive to the goals that that you just outlined. There also could possibly be a significant more amount of moderation, which could be good or bad depending on how it's done, how the policies are enacted. But it also could come with fewer avenues for online speech because a news site might just say, you know, user comments aren't worth it anymore. And again, that might be good or bad depending on what your thoughts are. I also think, in this kind of the cynical part of me that's been in DC for too long, but I think probably the big platforms are going to survive. And I think the mid-sized platforms without Section 230, like Pinterest, that actually have really innovative ways of coming up with moderation policies, I think they might have a harder time adjusting to the rules. So, but I mean, I can't say with any certainty what would exactly happen if you just got rid of Section 230 altogether. And I mean, I think there are a lot of other proposals on the table from both sides that are much more sort of nuanced, that get at the goals much better than just saying, let's just strike the entire law from the books and pretend it didn't happen.
Jen, what? Yeah. Oh, Danielle, looks like you have something to say.
No, just a quip that it's sort of like saying, let's do surgery when a Band-Aid will do. And I always keep thinking of it every time I say, like, get rid of 230. It's like, let's bring some more nuance to the table here, friends. But Jen, take it away.
Sorry, go ahead, Brian. I think there may be an issue with Jen's audio right now. We're trying to figure out.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Jen can hear us, but she can't speak right now because of a connection issue.
Oh no. Well, so as we think about this, it's obvious that, you know, Section 230 isn't going anywhere anytime soon from a conversation piece. We know that both sides now, whether that's Speaker Pelosi or Senator Hawley, Senator Cruz, President Trump, Vice President Biden, have all weighed in on Section 230. As we start to get closer to the presidential election, what are you watching for? What do you expect to see, and is there anything that you're concerned about from a conversation perspective or from an action perspective that may further complicate discussions around Section 230?
I wish I could call on my co-author, Bobby, but I think I could speak for both of us when I say that what really worries me, right, Bobby, I see you smiling. What really worries me are the potential for disinformation, and in particular deep fakes, to overrun, you know, to really change the whole outcome of the election in ways that, you know, if timed just right, what do we say, like at decision junctures, right, Bobby? If timed just right, and if platforms aren't proactive about it, if they don't have any legal incentive to address defamatory content that could upend an election, I worry that we don't have enough legal levers to pressure them. And I guess I'm also really worried, and I was happy to tell them, though they weren't happy to hear it, that Facebook's policy not to take down or think, you know, of falsehoods in ads, and not to make those political ads, very granular political ads, at all transparent. There's no accountability. Ads are sort of tailored per person. Like, so a neo-Nazi gets an ad that says, you know, neo-Nazis for X candidate, in a way that we would never find acceptable if we weren't talking about online platforms. I'm really worried about the kind of disinformation that we're going to see, not only in sort of digital forgeries or deepfakes, but also in political ads, and that we don't have enough incentives around responsible behavior because these companies make money of like, clicks, and shares. And I think any conversation about Section 230 must be paired with a conversation around the fact that we don't have comprehensive data privacy protections. And so together they're the perfect storm of a nightmare, which is all your shareholders, you want to do right by them. And so your like, clicks, and shares are what make you money. And so of course you're going to allow the deep fake that runs rampant, right? Or these political ads, because it's in your interest of your bottom line. And I'm worried about our democracy. Bobby, did I do all right?
Always goes without saying. 100%.
Danielle, two follow-up questions on that. One is, how much concern should we be looking at with shallow fakes? Speaker Pelosi's video last summer that was slowed down to intentionally look like she was slurring or was drunk on the dais. And how do we think about those, especially when you consider, the reaction from when being called out was, this was a parody, or this was, intentionally supposed to be funny. And of course, everybody can tell the difference, as opposed to a deep fake, which is very complicated. Any concern on the shallow fakes and what that might look like?
Oh, absolutely. So Bobby and I have written about, up at Lawfare about, the Pelosi video, and it's a continuum. So our worries about, manipulated media, of course, will cover the kinds of manipulation or slowing down that we saw in the sort of cheap fakes or shallow fakes. They can be just as destructive as the deep fake. Deep fake is just more destructive because we believe it. We have a visceral reaction. It hits us in the gut, and there's no way for rapid fire technologists to say, as Hani Farid would say, oh, that's a fake. So often they really can't detect it. And so absolutely, Brian, like the continuum isn't just, of course, the AI generated deep fake that you can't, or is almost impossible to detect, also includes shallow fakes, and more broadly, kind of disinformation that unfortunately, like I hear you, Brian, when you say that the Pelosi video, of course, in context, the argument is it's parody. But the truth of the matter is, when you looked at it in context, it was defamatory, right? That it slowed down and made her look sick or ill. And I worry that without proactive and responsibility enhancing incentives, that platforms will leave up a lot of destructive information, including like diverting people from voting polls at the right time, as we saw in 2016. So my heart aches over the potentials. And you're right, it's not just deep fakes, right? It's disinformation more broadly, and our human tendency to share and to believe it because we see it with our eyes.
And then how do you respond? One of the counter arguments to doing targeted online advertising is, of course, the fact that direct mail has been around for a long time, and direct mail allows for the same type of targeting to a house, at least. And so the argument that is made is, well, look, it's really no different from what's been done for a long time, in the fact that you can send out those mailers to an individual house on an address or a very small zip code, so zip +4. So what's the argument that is in fact, when we're talking about it being on the digital side, that it is different? And of course, coming from that world, I have a lot of opinions on this, on why it is in fact different, but interested to hear what your views are on that.
Right, because it's not just scale, right? As we think of the folks that Alan Weston wrote about when he wrote this magnificent report on the data banks in a free world, in which he was assessing in 1968. So our Polk, all those companies that were indeed doing direct advertising, it was like they had telephone books full of information about people, not the databases we have today, or massive reservoirs of personal information. So it's not just the scale, right? It's the way in which they can exploit and manipulate and have comprehensive view of all of our information, including, and I'm writing right now about intimate information about our intimate lives, that they can exploit it in ways that make us so vulnerable to manipulation. So it isn't just that we've, of course, had direct mail and advertising for ages, right? And it has been tailored. It was tailored in the late 60s, right? With collecting that information. But it's not just the scale, but it's the ability to target people at their most vulnerable moments and to A/B test. Will you click on? So for Ryan Calo, so folks who want literature, Ryan Calo wrote a wonderful piece called Digital Market Manipulation. and in GW Law Review, it came out about 5 years ago. And it's about all the ways in which advertisers can manipulate us. So women are shown, I don't know for the women on the call, makeup ads early morning, Monday morning, because it's when we're most likely to feel like shit about ourselves, apparently. So marketers sort of like grab us when we're most vulnerable, right? When we're most inclined. It's against our best interests. It's in the interest of advertisers. And that's just a small, tiny, benign example. So it's scale and manipulation, exploitation. It's avenues of persuasion is how I would say. So Bryan, I'm interested, of course, in what, having worked in the industry, why are you so persuaded that it is different? It's the same idea, but it's different in kind because of the changes.
Yeah, it's to me at least it is significantly different in the fact that you're able to get very granular, and to your point, you're able to walk people down the path by finding out what they do like and what they don't like. The one thing about direct mailing is you send something, and most of the time the reaction is to recycle it or throw it away. It's not to take the action. And so not knowing what's happening, you don't know what's going on. And so when you start to see direct advertising and you have that ability to not A/B test, but to A, B, C, all the way to Z test, which issue do you resonate with? What messaging do you resonate with? And to be able to use algorithmic exploitation to be able to run those, back in 2009, Google bought a company that allowed you to take a banner ad and to carve it into 5 different layers. So there was the background color, there was a image, there was a call to action, there was the language, and using those, you could quickly come up with 25,000 different ads. And what you would do is basically turn that ad on and say, go optimize, and start collecting the information about who's engaging which. And all of a sudden you find out that this small segment of individuals that have these attributes, these demographics and sociographics and geographic attributes are engaging with this. And now you can take that ad and say, okay, well, now I'm going to expand it even further. But once you get them captured, now the fun begins from a marketer perspective, because now I know that you're vulnerable. So now I can convince you what is really happening and take you down that path, which is where, the algorithms and the ongoing exploitation of some of the YouTube algorithms that take you down either terroristic or conspiracy theories, and find out that, not only can we get you more convinced that this one conspiracy theory, the world is flat conspiracy theory is true, but you might also be interested in finding out about some of these other conspiracy theories and what does that look like. So, I think it is substantially different, not only the velocity, but also the immediate implication of that information coming back into the feedback loop and taking what used to be the phone books of information and now being able to say, okay, now we've got the fish on the hook. What do we want to do with them going forward? Jeff, what are you watching for heading into the 2020 presidential election and worried about or concerned about or interested to see play out?
Yeah, so I'm worried about everything Danielle's worried about. And then that she said very well, I'm worried about disinformation. I hope, and at least it's hard to tell from public reports, but I also think there's part of the equation where the government national security apparatus needs to also be helping. And I mean, at least from public reports, it sounds like there have been various initiatives, which I think are important as well. But frankly, when it comes to elections in general, not just presidential, I'm terrified of more hacking happening. I don't think, and I mean, this is a little off base from Section 230, but at least based on the public reports, it sounds like campaigns have not learned all that much from what happened in 2016 in terms of their investments in security. It's hard to tell because they might not say everything in the public reports, but during the Democratic primary, I think only one candidate had a dedicated information security official. So in addition to all of the very real concerns about the various types of fakes, I'm also very concerned that there's nothing to alleviate my concerns about there being more actual information obtained illegally that will cause chaos again. And then we could talk another time about election security, which is a totally different topic, but I'm also worried about that.
We've talked a lot about kind of the concerns, where things are headed, you know, some of the issues with proposed solutions to Section 230 and how we fix the internet. Danielle, your paper with Mary Ann concludes with a bunch of recommendations on potential ways that we might be able to fix and reform the internet. Which ones do you think are the most likely to get passed, and why do you think they'll have an impact on the internet moving forward?
So I just have to say that Jen is back. So I'm very excited to see her. So I don't know if you want to call on Jen first.
Yes. Jen, welcome back.
Oh no, can we not hear you? There's no voice?
Oh no.
Oh, that's
Oh, no.
so sad. Oh my goodness. It's amazing to see your beautiful face, but sad we can't hear from you.
Jen, could you phone in using your phone?
Oh wow.
Oh.
Okay.
Trying her. Oh man.
Could you mute the computer, Jen, and call in?
Yeah, that's a smart idea, right? Yeah.
Yeah, there may be a way on Zoom to switch from the internet dial-in to the phone dial-in, and maybe that will work. Well, let us know, Jen, when you're able to talk, and we'll call on you.
Okay, so Bryan, sorry I didn't mean to play teacher. You know, you asked like what of our proposals might we see some movement on, and what's interesting is I have to say I think so. I've been working with a bunch of different offices as well as some folks in the Department of Justice, and I think we might see some interesting developments. I don't know if I've convinced folks to adopt what Ben and I, you know, our statutory language and proposal for 230C1, which is to keep the immunity, keep the legal shield, but condition it on reasonable content moderation practices. But I do think there is a push to ensure that these, you know, interactive service, you know, users or providers of interactive computer services, that they're more transparent, both about their speech policies and their practices, you know, accountability practices. And where I think so in my book, in Hate Crimes in Cyberspace, I talked about like the concept that I had used when talking about automated systems, but technological due process, right? That we want that people, because they're so powerful, they, you know, individuals and given their speech interests and all of their reputational interests, they want a chance to know what these companies mean when they say, for example, we ban hate speech, or we ban threats, we ban political, you know, disinformation and ads, whatever it may be. People not only want to understand in detail those speech rules, but they also want to have mechanisms to challenge decisions made about their speech, right? If they are, if they feel like they've been shadow banned, content taken down, suspended. And I think we might see some movement in that direction. Like whether we can do it right is always the question, right? I feel like, Jeff, you're nodding your head. Like, you know, the idea, you know, and talking to so many offices around the Hill, my constant refrain is, okay, but are we going to disincentivize monitoring? Are we going to push these platforms back to where we were, where they sit on their hands? Or like the heckler's veto, they just take everything down. And that's a nightmare. I mean, I don't want that either. So, you know, I think we should say stay tuned for some new developments that are coming down the pike. And I'm doing my best to make sure that they're not disastrous like we saw with FOSTA and SESTA.
Jeff, what do you see as something that might be able to improve Section 230, other than convincing everybody that the misconceptions we talked about at the very beginning aren't actually part of Section 230?
Well, that's actually, I think, a really important part, and that's what I've just been focused. I meet with a lot of offices, and my main focus is just explaining in more detail what I explained at the beginning. I think it's important to have an accurate factual history. In terms of changes, one thing that I've really been hoping to change, and a lot of my proposals get into the weeds to address really specific but important harms. I'm currently writing a book about anonymity and the history of anonymity, and a lot of what I'm looking at are people who have been harmed by anonymous people online. And it's really hard to go after someone who's an anonymous poster because you have to convince a court to unmask them. There's First Amendment balancing tests, all sorts of things.
As we're seeing with Devin Cow's Twitter account.
Yeah, yeah, but oftentimes what the goal is, it's not looking to get money from the person, it's to get the material down, get something that's ruining someone's life offline. And there are cases where material where someone is suing someone else is adjudicated to be defamatory or illegal. A court says this is illegal, this is defamatory, and then the person takes this order and gets an injunction saying remove this adjudicated illegal material. And there was a case a few years ago called Hassel v. Bird from the California Supreme Court, where a very narrowly divided Supreme Court, the plurality said Section 230 protects this. That's something, and this isn't going to get at what most of the sort of DC concerns are. It gets to a concern that I increasingly have just because of what I see, where, you know, if this is going to be adjudicated defamatory, there should be a mechanism to get it offline. And that's one type of thing. Another issue, this gets to my concern, there are a lot of websites, and Danielle's written about a lot of these websites that are just really bad. There's not, they traffic in the worst types of content. And I think with sufficient fact finding, they could be found to having contributed to the development of the content. Because Section 230 doesn't protect a website that even partly contributes to the development of content. But the problem is Section 230 cases are usually dealt with at a motion to dismiss 12b6 stage. What I would like to see, and we have this for things like personal jurisdiction, I'd like to see some sort of mechanism that allows a judge, in a case where the judge believes that there's at least some cause to show that the website's contributed to the harm, to allow limited discovery on the development issue. And that would go, again, this is sort of my concern about going after the really bad actors. And I think I think frankly the Backpage case, which led to Sesta Fosta, I think if we had something like that in place, I think that opinion never would have happened, because we would have had enough information to show that they were contributing to the content. So those are my sorts of wish list for narrow changes. I also agree with Danielle about transparency. The platforms are powerful enough, they're big enough that they need to be transparent. And we have transparency requirements in all sorts of industries. There's no reason why we can't have that here. So I'd like to see that as well.
I can speak. Can you hear me?
Yay!
Wow.
Jen, what would you like to see as ways to fix the internet going forward?
So I just want to pick up on something that Jeff just said, because I think that there's a huge problem with the way that courts have interpreted Section 230. So I think, you know, a big chunk of what we're dealing with, in my view, results from overbroad interpretation of what Section 30 was meant to protect and cover, and that a lot of the egregious harms that Danielle's written a lot about and that Jeff was just talking about now could have and should have been dealt with via, in my view, more tailored and appropriate understandings of what Section 230 deals with and was meant to address. And I worry about that. You asked earlier, when I couldn't speak, but you asked earlier about what we worry about with respect to the election, and I share all of the concerns that were already said about misinformation and disinformation and the hacking issues and everything else. But I also worry that in response to that, that we, you know, don't necessarily go the route of the EO, but that we start making 230 the culprit for all of these really harmful things that we need to deal with and that we absolutely need to deal with, and that platforms absolutely need to take more responsibility for. But I worry that 230 has been become the easy scapegoat and the easy answer. And I don't think reforming 230 is going to answer those problems. And I think I think Danielle is proposing eminently sensible reforms, and I think Jeff is proposing eminently sensible reforms, but there's a lot of reform proposals that are less sensible, and I worry that that becomes a way forward. And along those lines, transparency is key. I mean, there's transparency is always key. The fact that we haven't been able to pass the Honest Ads Act, to me, is really so bizarre and so concerning. It's bipartisan, it's so sensible, and it's something that seems like an obvious positive step forward in ensuring that we can assess better as a society what kind of ads we're receiving, and it also, while not solving the micro-targeting problem, helps a little bit with that as well if we have more visibility into what's actually being said and to whom.
To follow up on that real quick, and I'd like to turn it over to all the panelists or all the people watching today and see if they have any questions as well. But one last question for you real quick, Jen, is, do the platforms find themselves in kind of a catch-22 right now, where, Twitter has come out and weighed in on certain issues related to voting, but not necessarily all the way on all the disinformation if it's on their platform. And so now they're in this position where they've weighed in a little bit, but not all the way. If they continue down that road, they're going to get told that their content they're moderating too much content. If they don't continue it, they're going to be told that they're not being responsible and that they're allowing certain disinformation, but others. Have they put themselves in an untenable situation by putting a toe in the water here versus completely picking one way or the other?
Well, I don't know if I wouldn't use the word catch-22. I mean, I think it's complicated, and these are really hard issues. And I think whatever line is chosen, there's going to be people that critique it and that say that it doesn't go far enough or goes too far. But I think Twitter's right, absolutely right, to be drawing the line, and that Facebook's attempt to avoid kind of engaging and getting in the line drawing by just saying, if the president speaks or there's a political ad, we're not going to get into this at all. I think that's a way worse outcome. And hopefully people can, I think, responsibly critique Twitter or any other platform for the particular line they're drawing, while also recognizing that they ought to be praised for trying to draw a line, at least when the alternative is just, failing to take the responsibility seriously at all, and just not even trying to do really, basic fact checking about really basic misinformation and disinformation.
I would also
briefly.
I would also just briefly add, I think the platforms, I don't know, but I'm hoping they learned a lesson from the Sesta Fosta issue, where when it was first proposed, I mean, there was this Backpage ruling, there was this this documentary, I Am Jane Doe, which I recommend everyone watch, that tells the stories of people who are trying to sue Backpage after horrific crimes. And the platform's response was, at first, this is about frivolous tort lawyers. And it was so tone deaf. And by the time they recovered from it, they were basically locked out of any serious negotiations. And the result was a really inadequate bill, where I think if they had engaged meaningfully from the beginning, I think that we might have a more workable bill that addressed the issue better. So I'm at least maybe hopeful that they've learned something from FOSTA, but who knows?
All right, I think we've got time for two or three questions. So if anybody would like to unmute themselves and ask a question, floor is open up for questions.
I'm wondering about the implications of Section or Article 230 more broadly, like internationally. I know about China with their sovereign internet or their bifurcated internet, and I'm wondering how U.S. actions towards 230 would change our ability to influence the kind of internet we want to see in other countries.
That's so Jen. Jen, right? Our expert about speech across borders. Like you got your expert.
So it's a really interesting question, and you may be aware that this has been a big dispute with trade agreements, where there has been a long-term effort there has been an effort over the last several years to push other countries to adopt the equivalent of Section 230 into as a condition of entering certain trade agreements. And there's been very active vocal dispute about whether or not that is a good idea or a bad idea. I mean, I think Section 230 isn't particularly the issue, but your question raises really critical issues about the fact that we live in a globally interconnected world, and that speech crosses borders, and we've long promoted, at least in the United States, an internet that is not a closed system in the way that the China system is in a lot of ways, not completely, but in a lot of ways. And so we have to both pursue our speech norms, but also respect other norms across borders and manage those differences in ways that allow for other countries to regulate in some ways that may be inconsistent with the First Amendment, but also respect basic free speech values and figure out ways to manage different answers to those questions across borders. It's really complicated. I think some of it can be done through geo-blocking, but not all of it. And so really, really interesting and hard set of issues.
Thank you.
Joel Carter.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Joel. I'm a postgrad research fellow for Protego Press. So I had a couple of you on the panel that I know. This question is for all the panelists. I guess as we've seen European Union nations, the EU, be proactive in governing the internet, what lessons should the US be learning as we approach the general election this November? Thank you.
So I'll take a first step. I think it's a lesson that lasts far beyond the general election. But I think, and this goes back a little bit to what I was trying to say before. You know, it was just 10 years ago that Hillary Clinton kind of stood in the museum and gave her big, huge internet freedom agenda. And at the time, there was a sense that free and open internet meant happiness and prosperity and interconnection in ways that were going to lift dissidents and save the world. And as I think we've just been talking about for almost the last hour, there's also lots and lots of harms that are perpetuated online. And the free and open internet often is not free for huge segments of the population. And so I think, you know, the United States has, you know, continues to sometimes talk about the free and open internet, but we don't have a coherent approach for building that and promoting it and selling it. And what we're seeing, I think, is a growing success of the China alternative and the China narrative, and the ability to sell a system that allows for a range of different controls in ways that ultimately, I think, are inconsistent with our values. And so I think we have a huge opportunity and a huge need to proactively pursue a responsible internet agenda that recognizes the values of freedom and openness, but also addresses the many, many harms that are being perpetuated online, and promote that in an affirmative way and not just a reactive way. And that is a huge job and a huge opportunity that is going to last us for many, many years, but I think it's important for us normatively and economically and geopolitically.
I think, Jeff, do you have to hop like in 2 seconds? So you go first.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with everything that was said. Am I, okay, yeah, no, I'm not muted. Yeah, my only other, and this kind of echoing what I had said earlier, but I think this does go far beyond Section 230. I think when you're looking at the international landscape, it's impossible to dismiss the fact that so much of these threats are coming not from within the United States when you're talking about the elections, but from other countries. And this is a whole other area of my research that I would love to get into now, which is the U.S. Cyber command posture in terms of addressing these sort of far below armed conflict aggression. We have a new operational concept and strategy that I'm very happy to see. It'll be nice to see how it plays out. But I do think that 230 is a part of it. But as Jen was saying, it is a part. And there's a whole lot of other things that we have to be looking at. And I think especially how we deal with these other countries that are causing all of these problems, we really have to have a better focus on that. And I'm sorry, I do have to run now. It was very fun. Thank you for having me. And I don't want Carrie Goldberg to get angry at me for being late, so I will talk to you later.
Thank you, Jeff, for being here this evening, and good luck on your second panel tonight.
Thanks.
So I would just say that as we remember that we're not the only players in this space, and so I've written a bit about the ways in which Europe and the European Commission has pressed platforms, compelled them in some ways to conform their policies to a more European style approach. And this is particular to terrorist speech, extremist speech, and hate speech. And I think we can't underestimate just the importance of the kind of coercive role of other states on our norms. And sometimes that shift is a good one. But I love the question because it's a recognition that these platforms are global, and often these companies do the cheapest thing, which is just have a one-size-fits-all terms of service where it's a ratchet up to more censorship. So again, like just part of an interesting, I think as Jen said so well in her feature book, and all of her work has been, and you should read it, about sort of speech across borders and the significance of all these moves.
Yeah, one thing that I will add is that there are a lot of good practices that are being developed in other countries that are having the same issues and same problems that we are having, and whether or not those solutions would work here due to First Amendment and other issues, the time, temporal, location type on when you can ban speech and what that looks like, especially as it relates to deep fakes and some of the stuff that France is doing on moratoriums and issues around that. There's a lot of really good best practices at other countries that have been dealing with this the same time that we've been struggling with it, or sometimes longer. And how do we figure out collectively what is working and what is not, so that we can try to figure out what can apply due to different laws in each of the different countries. All right, we have one time for one more question, and then we're gonna have to wrap up for this evening.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi. So my question is, what we touched on the privacy aspect of this and how a lot of the misinformation is only so accurate because of the hyper-targeting from the data. And my question is, are you able to separate that issue from platforms whose core business model is surveillance? And to that end, what is the role of antitrust in all of this?
I'm so not an antitrust person. Jen, Bryan, it's not my bailiwick. So privacy law, I think, has to play a crucially important role, and we're working on it, privacy reforms. So Jen, do you know anything about antitrust here, or have some thoughts?
Not enough to say anything sufficiently articulate. I think that, again, I think sometimes, just like I think sometimes we look to abolishing Section 230 or as the answer, breaking up the companies becomes a mantra that I think you have to kind of lift the veil a little bit and figure out you're breaking them up for what reasons and what are the rules and obligations on the smaller companies as well. It's, as much as we spend a lot of time, and I think it was Jeff who said earlier that the big companies are incredibly powerful, and that's so very true. And we should think about that. But I think we also can't forget that some of the smaller entities, like look at 8chan or 4chan or 8chuck, are real cesspools of hate as well. And so, you know, smaller is not necessarily the answer. It can be for some things, but I think like all things, we have to look very critically at what we're asking for and why and what we think we'll achieve by it.
I think that there is a good opportunity to think about, you know, antitrust, adding potentially a new layer to the HSR requirements that companies during M&A have to go through to say, what does the data look like? You know, one of the big reasons that this is interesting right now is because of Instagram and Facebook and the way that they are combining the entity to be able to have that data flow back and forth between all their acquisitions. And if you think about what that means going forward, is that theoretically, you know, the old model was that companies would eventually die because they weren't innovative. Big companies can't innovate, small companies do. And what has happened over the past 20 years is that tech companies in particular have figured out that if they can't copy a smaller company's technology and their features and functionality, they'll just buy the company. And even if that means that they pay $20 billion for WhatsApp, it's probably worth it because now they have yet another set of information, another set of users that if they combine into the same set of data, now they can use that data to continue to do micro-targeting, continue to have reach. And even if people stop using Facebook, the number of people that continue to come somewhere into my life and say, well, they're very frustrated with Facebook, so they've left Facebook and they're only using Instagram now, is absurd. Because people don't realize that that's essentially the same data set and they're providing exactly the same information back to the same company that they're frustrated with. So as we think about M&A and as we think about the data collection going forward, I think it is an interesting approach. I think it's a second order problem. I think we still have to figure out what privacy means, what responsible data usage means, who owns data going forward. But I do think that as we look at down the road, how do companies buy additional data sets and additional users for their reach, that thinking about it from an antitrust perspective becomes pretty interesting. All right. Well, on behalf of the Strauss Center and the University of Texas at Austin, Danielle, Jen, thank you very much for you joining us this evening. I feel like we could have continued this conversation for quite a bit longer, but I know you are both very busy and have other things that you need to go and get done and study and write more and keep us educated by publishing on these topics for us going forward. So thank you very much. Thank you to everybody that joined us this evening. Hopefully you enjoyed the conversation and learned something, and we will be putting this up on YouTube shortly for anybody that wasn't able to make it through the entire session this evening. So thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you. Sorry about the audio glitches in the middle.
No worries. I'm glad we got you back at the end.
I am too. Thank you.
Bye,
Bye, everyone.
Bye.